Welcome to Subject to Power. I can hardly believe that we're about to start our 4th season of Subject to Power. I'm Elle and I just want to take a moment to thank each and every guest who has come on here and who has so generously shared their thoughts and their work and expertise, who've been so willing to explore so many very complex cultural questions with me. I so appreciate the willingness that each of my conversation partners in these last 51 episodes, which I can barely wrap my mind around, that we've done so many, to grapple with genuinely difficult and sensitive topics and in the most sincere way. And it all feels like a huge gift to me. I feel privileged to have had the opportunity to have these talks with such gifted thinkers about the state of the world and what is happening in our cultures, and who share my concern for women and the status of women in different parts of the world, and of course, where all of humanity is headed. I also want to thank our listeners. We have been so fortunate to have a faithful and steadily growing audience over these last 3 years. And our listenership numbers continue to grow, which is incredibly rewarding to see, especially considering how many podcasts are out there to choose from. And we appreciate everyone who downloads and listens to this show. We do get a lot of feedback through social media and emails, and it's very clear that the show sparks thoughts and feelings, and I can't tell you how much it means to me that you take the time to write and share your ideas, your responses to particular guests, and your thoughts about the subjects we're covering. So we are kicking off season 4 with a fantastic new episode, an interview with nonfiction writer Rachel Hewitt. Rachel is British, and she writes about women's lives, past and present. She writes about feminism, grief, trauma, and recovery, and her own great passion, running and the great outdoors. And as you'll hear, we cover a big, sprawling map of topics, which is my favorite type of conversation, one that goes kind of all places at once. From Rachel's research and writing about women's history in sports and outdoors adventure, and how that same history was erased, how women navigate in public space now and then, the constantly changing shape of misogyny, and how women weigh being safe against being free. We also talk about Rachel's own ultra running career and how immersion in nature can carry you through grief and trauma, and a whole lot more. Hope you enjoy our talk.
Right. Okay, I think I've done it. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for making time for me and talking to me. I'm so excited to talk about all the things. And you, of course, wrote In Her Nature, which is kind of what I want to get to first, but you're also now writing a lot of Substack. You're being very prolific on your newly renamed Substack, correct?
Yeah, that's right. It was previously called In Her Nature because I thought when I first launched the Substack that I'd be likely to spend most of my time writing about women in the outdoors and women's relationships with the natural world. But actually, I sort of realized that my interest in that subject is increasingly framed by how activities like running and immersion in nature are beneficial for women after trauma. And so I've become interested in other ways in which women survive and even learn to thrive after traumatic events. So the new name of the Substack, Small Revolutions Every Day, is really designed to reflect my interest, I suppose, in literally the small revolutions that particularly women, I think, can implement in day-to-day lives to, really to think about how to survive in this current era of like profound misogyny and backlash.
Yeah, I have another podcast called Chat in the Commons that we just started, and it's framed exactly around that we are in a backlash/awakening, and that there are a lot of questions to be had about how women deal with it. And I absolutely love the content of your Substack. I think it's so full of like practical viewpoints. It's not just big picture analysis. It's really like granular.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things I've been interested in is when I was younger, I thought of feminist progress and feminist backlash as being things that sort of took place in the political arena, in legislation. And I've actually become, I think, probably even more interested in how backlash permeates our culture and how it's something that sort of grinds us down in our everyday lives and in our marriages and relationships and in our homes and in our beds and in our minds. For girls being socialized in this current era, I really worry about the effect on their sort of sense of self and their possibilities, thinking about sort of everyday life and the sort of encounters with men and with toxic thinking. That's what we're coming up against all the time. And, the accumulated force of it really grinds us down, I think.
Yeah, so true. So you wrote a book called In Her Nature, which sort of weaves together some recent history of women in sports and the outdoors, as well as your own excursions in ultra running, which I just have to parenthetically say was a new concept to me.
Oh,
And
okay.
I've ran all my life, but I didn't know what that was. And I had a trouble conceptualizing the distances you talk about and run. So I found that fascinating. But then also reflections on the limitations women are experiencing in the outdoors now and then. So if you can talk a little bit about what led you to want to write In Her Nature.
Yeah, I mean, the book starts with an event that probably was my spur into writing the book. I went to a running shop and I needed to buy a new pair of shoes. And I was kind of staggered at the sheer variety of running shoes that are on offer, for kind of any distance, any surface. But I wanted to buy shoes that were specific to my female feet, and asked the shop assistant, what trail running shoes he had for women. And he's like, oh, actually, we've only got like 2 models. And, and I asked him, well, like, why? And his response was, well, men have been running since ancient Greece, whereas women only started trail running in the 1970s. So kit designers are playing catch up, basically. And I sort of nodded and smiled at the time. And then afterwards, I sort of was starting to think about this statement that women only started running in the 1970s. And it just seemed so ludicrous to me, such a ludicrous claim. But I did a bit of cursory digging around on historical websites, and I found it was a claim that was repeated over and over again with application to other outdoor sports. So there's, plenty of climbing blogs that suggest that women only started climbing in the 1970s, that women only started long distance hiking in the 1970s, that women only started skiing in the 1970s. And I kind of wanted to just probe this further because it seemed really unlikely to me. These sort of activities like walking or running, they're things that, a lot of people do from birth or from toddlerhood, that I'm
Of
constantly having
course.
to tell my children to sort of stop running around the house, And so it just seemed completely ridiculous to me, the idea that this was a completely novel mode of motion for women until 50 years ago. So the book sort of started with me really just wanting to kind of probe this claim, this kind of popular version of the history of women's sport, and to kind of look a bit deeper. And while I was doing so, I found an archive of photographs that were taken in the 1880s and 1890s by a woman called Lizzie LeBlond, who was an alpine climber and really at the sort of forefront of a lot of mountain sports. And her photographs are fascinating because they're not just of her, they're of all the women that she participated in these sports with. And, these women are so different from what I'd imagined as being the stereotype of Victorian women. Racing around mountains or sort of hills and dales in what we'd call now fell running races. There's teams of women playing a sort of early version of ice hockey. There's women doing skeleton racing, so racing head first downhill on skeleton sledges, going at about 70, 80 miles an hour, kind of completely different to the version I had in my head of women's sport, but also of Victorian women.
Yeah, serious athletic endeavors.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And full of all the stuff that, women today are still told we're not good at, like risk. It was full of risk management and strength and flexibility and, yeah, absolutely extraordinary images.
The whole idea of women being erased from this history, I'm going to quote from you. We've been left with only a fragmentary set of ideas about his city, his mountains, his moor, his river, his park. And I think this is bad for women today who need to feel at home in the outdoors.
Yeah, in surveys that are being done today over the last 20 years of teenage girls, when they're asked about what kind of puts them off sport, either as spectators or as participants, it's commonplace to hear them say that, well, sport's not for them. Sport's a blokey thing. Sport's a kind of male pursuit. And, repeating that idea that all those blogs I came across said that, essentially sort of thinking of women as interlopers, recent interlopers into an activity that's historically been male. And I think that's such a pernicious myth that does so much damage to women and girls today still. And so I felt it was, both personally and from a feminist standpoint, a really important activity actually to unearth some of the women who were very active in sports. And I think also crucially to show that they weren't outliers. Often when I sort of talk about Lizzie LeBlond, someone in the audience will say, but she was an outlier. She was extraordinary for her time. And it's like, well, yes, she was, because she was so good. But she wasn't an outlier just in terms of participating in sport. There were thousands of women, up in the Alps with her participating in all these sports, but also less formal pursuits like running, like hiking, in Britain in the 19th century. There's thousands of women taking part. This was a sort of cultural norm until it stopped being a cultural norm.
Yeah, which I want to get to. But before that, I'm Norwegian. I grew up in Norway and hiked and climbed and skied and spent my entire childhood outdoors. So I know what that did for me in terms of making me one with my body and competent, and which you write about a lot. But even so, come puberty, I developed what you write about, which is double consciousness that women have. Can you talk a little bit about what you're talking about when you say that?
Yeah, so when I was working on the book, it wasn't just a matter of, wanting to unearth this history. I also wanted to explore some of my experiences in running. And I kind of always take the attitude that if there's something I've experienced, then I'm not the only one, right? This is probably likely to be quite common among women. It's just that often we don't have the vocabulary or the authority to sort of talk about it. And one of the things that I really wanted to explore was this sense I have, not just when I'm running, but sort of everywhere, always, that I'm seeing myself, and I'm doing it while I'm talking to you. I'm trying not to look at the side of the screen that my face is on. But it's this sense of, it's hard for women and girls to sort of just be, to act, that we're always conscious of how we're looking to an external observer, even if there's no one there. And I feel this is something that's kind of been with me for as long as my conscious memory has been with me. And I found this extraordinary essay by a philosopher called Iris Marion Young. And the essay is called Throwing Like a Girl. And she explores this idea of the kind of split consciousness and how it disrupts women and girls in sport. And she describes how when a man or a boy might throw a ball or run to catch a ball, if they're not conscious of how they look like to an external observer, it can be a sort of fluid movement that all happens sort of instantaneously and without even reaching consciousness. It's this kind of easy, fluid motion. Whereas she suggests for girls and women that the process is much more interrupted, that as well as making these decisions about how to move our body and where to move our body, we're also interrupted by our consciousness coming into play. And our consciousness is saying, you look fat, you look sweaty, you're crap at catching anything. This world of sport, it's not for you. And these might not be fully articulated, but they're thoughts that we have there. They interrupt us, they kind of interrupt our ability to play sport, but they also interrupt our ability to kind of be in the world in a sort of fluid, natural and unconscious way. And that just hugely resonated with me. I mean, it really, when I read it, I was like, oh my God, she's writing about me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about you running on the moor and on these long trails, and the competence and planning and all of the things that it takes for you to accomplish that, and how against that effort, this double consciousness would work because you have to be so present.
It is something that really dogged me for my first years in running, because I mainly did at first run in populated places where, there are a lot of passers-by, and, and women and girls do have the very frequent experience of being yelled at by men when they're running. So actually, it's not in our heads that we're being watched as we're running, and that we're being watched and judged in a hostile way. Like, it is happening. That used to be a sort of almost daily part of my running experience. And yeah, in those sort of early years, I did a lot of kind of more formal events, races and things. And I was very conscious about my pace and, where I was placing in the result sheets. And all of that functions as like a sort of judgmental external observer as well. But, I've sort of tried to find a way over the years, I think, to make running far more private and an activity that I think has far more to do with how I feel inside myself. Trying to do away with that split consciousness, actually trying to sort of minimize the sort of internalized critical voices, but also construct settings where, I am less likely to be catcalled or whatever because I'm running on a moor where there's no one else.
Yeah, yeah. You return to this again and again in Her Nature about the restorative aspect of being outdoors, how it restores us to ourselves in a way.
I sort of think that in the context of my current interest in how trauma affects women and girls, I think, I've started writing a bit more about my marriage and the fact that I'm sort of coming to terms with the fact that in some ways it was quite abusive, really. And I think one of the ways in which that abuse was sort of manifested within myself is that I lost all sense of, it's such a kind of trite or trivializing thing to say, sort of, I lost all my self-confidence, but I sort of mean that in the most profound way. Like, I sort of lost the sense of even having a separate self from my husband. And I lost any sense of, being able to make decisions for myself. Like I couldn't really say what I would prefer out of two options if they were given to me. I had no gut instinct. I had no intuition. I had very little ability even to sort of ascertain that what I was experiencing in the present moment was real. I found it very difficult to tell between something that I was experiencing and something that I might have dreamt or, sort of, anyway. So I sort of completely lost that grounding within myself, I think.
Yeah.
And one of the ways in which I started to get it back was through running, because, particularly long distance running, I think you really have to know yourself and know your body from the inside out. Like when I first started running, I sort of picked, I read Runner's World and I decided on a particular pace that I thought would have been a good pace for me to adopt. And I just said to myself, right, I'm going to run a half marathon with that pace. But it was ridiculous, right? Because it wasn't based on any self-knowledge. It was an arbitrary number. And it was way faster than I could actually go. So when I sort of finished that race, I was just really disappointed with myself because I'd sort of arbitrarily decided I wanted to run at, I think it was 5 minutes, 30 seconds for like the whole half marathon, and had run at 5 minutes 40, which is actually, something I'd now be fucking delighted with, but, I just berated myself because, because I wasn't running with any self-knowledge. Whereas I think now, in order to run the sort of distances that I love running, which is sort of anything from about 30, 40 miles upwards, you have to know, you have to sort of be able to understand the language that your body is using. I know that if I start to feel sick, it's actually that I'm hungry, that I've got to make myself eat something, otherwise the sickness is going to get worse. About 19 miles into a race, my knee will start hurting. And I know that about mile 25, it will stop hurting. So sort of that self-knowledge of how your body responds under different conditions and different temperatures and different points in a race is kind of really essential in order to get to the end. It's running really isn't a case of mind over matter. It's a case of matter and mind fully working together. And I think that gave me a grip on reality. I had to be able to trust my own perceptions, and I had to be able to trust what was going on in the world, and I had to make decisions on them. And that was hugely restorative for me.
Yeah, I can just imagine how that translates into other aspects of life. That once you develop a trust in your judgment or your knowledge or your perception, which I feel like, most of women are conditioned to be so wobbly and made to be insecure because we are not trusted in some very profound way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of realized how much I used to value the idea of being liked by random people, of being thought nice, as that word nice meant so, so much to me. Even people that I really hated, I kind of still wanted them to think that I was nice. And in the service of that, I would just put aside anything that was good for my own needs, sort of things like, so we've got some builders doing some work on the next door neighbour's house, and they have literally been using an angle grinder about 12 hours a day for the last week. And I hoped they'd have been finished by today. So I went over this morning and said, look, I'm recording this podcast. Please, could you not use your angle grinder between 1 and 2:30? And it struck me that, 10 years ago, there's no way I could have done that. That I would have been so scared of them thinking I wasn't nice,
But somehow it is the most frightening thing in the world for women to ask for accommodation.
It's part of kind of everyday life, isn't it? Just living in public space is to do with negotiating between different people's needs. And I think actually that's something I also wanted to, write about in Her Nature, is that the idea of sort of solitude and remoteness is a bit of a fantasy, that actually most of our sort of engagements with those kind of outdoor sports or pursuits are mediated through and around other people. And I got really interested in whether there'd been observations of how men and women move around public space, because I sort of felt like, both as someone walking down streets and sometimes, running or jogging down streets, I was constantly having to swerve out of the way of men who just seemed to barrel on kind of in a straight line with no sense of, it didn't even occur to them they might have moved out of my way.
Yeah.
And so I sort of was really interested to come across this sort of huge bank of research that was conducted in the 1970s into this question, which sort of, observed that women are far more likely to deviate their course when they're walking down a street, that men tend to just maintain a straight line. This also is bad for men, right? Because men are far more likely to be hit by cars. They just barrel on. And, women's cautiousness is not good for our kind of self-confidence or our kind of authority or our sort of material wealth in society, but it does keep us alive. Sorry, we shouldn't laugh about this, but
I wanted to jump back to Lizzie LeBlanc for a second, this mountaineering pioneer. And I don't want to call her an outlier, like you said, but there were some things about her. The time in which she did this, women had been enclosed or trapped indoors, for lack of a better term, for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the question of how and to what extent women have been trapped indoors is a huge one. And
Yes,
I think,
yes.
there are a lot of different theories and ideas. There's a really interesting book called Family Fortunes, which looks at the changing nature of the family and how that changes in accordance with the Industrial Revolution as the world of work moved out of the home and into sort of dedicated communal workspaces like factories or offices, that this took men out of the home and kind of left women there. I suppose what I've been sort of interested in her nature is looking at the emergence of a kind of outdoor adventure industry. Like, when did it become a kind of not bizarre thing to kind of go for a walk or to go for a run? And, and when did it become a sort of leisure activity as opposed to something that was part of everyday life and had practical purposes like travel or work? And then I kind of wanted to look at, well, and what does it mean to women? And what I sort of found was that the sort of first half of the 19th century is largely an era in which people do go on outdoor adventure holidays. They sort of set it up as independent travelers, and they do have a sense of themselves as kind of being the first to do this. Then there's a kind of period from around sort of 1850 to 1865, which is commonly thought of as the golden age of alpinism. There's the emergence of more of a tourist industry in kind of mountainous places. And then the period from about sort of 1865 onwards is a period in which sort of outdoor adventure, mountain travel has really become normalized. It's quite easy to go traveling if you've got the money. And Lizzie LeBlanc is very much part of that era, that movement. So where she comes from is not unusual, but what she does and the sort of dedication with which she pursues it and the sheer love she has for mountaineering, I think does set her apart. And she also goes to mountain resorts at times of the year where everyone else has gone home. So she is a kind of pioneer of winter alpine climbing, where obviously the conditions are much, much more serious, and she requires, sort of much more expertise. She also, she's quite dedicated to encouraging other women and girls to take part. She really becomes a bit of a celebrity, the go-to columnist for ladies' magazines, for someone writing about sort of sport or outdoor adventure. She writes something like 20 books that are published in like 60 languages about the experiences of climbing from a woman's point of view. So I think in that she's extraordinary, but she is far from the only woman, climbing in that era.
You write about all of the complications that come with being a woman climber. It's not like they could just take off their crinolines and skirts and all the cumbersome clothing and just put on a pair of ski pants. They actually climbed in those Victorian outfits, which I thought was just mind-blowing.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. When I first started working on this book, yeah, I thought, oh my God, I can't believe they climbed in skirts. Like, that is insane. And I suppose some part of me was probably a bit judgmental, a bit like, surely they were risking their lives for fashion and respectability. There are women like Lizzie who tried all sorts of different climbing gear, tried wearing bloomers, or there was what was sort of referred to as puttees or leggings, really made out of sort of strips of material, almost like bandages that were sort of wrapped around the legs. And Lizzie just decided she preferred climbing in skirts because actually they gave her a really wide range of movement. Skirts had other benefits. So she would often use her skirt as a blanket at night for sort of overnight camping. There's a couple of Victorian mountaineers who use their skirts as sledges. So we sort of zoom down mountains on them. But I think also crucially, like women found that they were able to go to the toilet quite discreetly with skirts on because they acted like this sort of voluminous screen really around them. But there is no doubt that that the clothes did bring difficulties. And, if you imagine like these thick woolen skirts, like when they got wet, they were incredibly heavy, that they were so long that they would catch on stones and rocks. So, women did also find workarounds. So Lizzie would sometimes wear her skirt until she was out of view of any villagers nearby. And then she would hide her skirt behind a rock and then climb on in trousers.
But then you write at some point, this whole sport or endeavors started to shut women out. And you say, what happened, I wonder, to drive Lizzie and women like her from the mountains and to make us forget that they were ever there at all? I wonder that too.
Yeah. So when I first found Lizzie and her archive of thousands and thousands of photographs, well, my first thought was like, oh my God, this is amazing. But my second thought was like, why haven't I heard of her? Like, why isn't she a sort of household name in the same way that, some of the sort of 19th century male pioneers of outdoor adventure are? And so, yeah, my intention in the book was, was to explore that question as well. So one of the things I became, that first piqued my interest, I suppose, was that the Swiss Alpine Club was seen as this kind of progressive organization that accepted women as members. And this was really different for someone like Lizzie, coming from London, where the London Alpine Club was, staunchly male only. The Swiss Alpine Club seemed to sort of represent the kind of inclusivity and progressive nature of European outdoor adventure. But in the first decade of the 20th century, the Swiss Alpine Club took a decision to drive women out, to throw them out, to cancel female memberships and become male only. And this seemed just so extraordinary to me, sort of in the context of the fact that for sort of 20 years, really, between the 1880s and 1900, you had sort of a lot of really world-class female athletes and adventurers who did actually get quite a lot of visibility and respect. And then suddenly to take that decision to say, well, actually, that's enough, and then I wanted to know, well, was the Swiss Alpine Club a one-off, or did this happen in other organizations as well? And sort of pretty much every organization I looked at, or every sort of sports facility, seems to have made a similar decision. If you look at women in football, women's football teams were just as active and successful as male football teams. They were particularly organized around kind of factory workers and munitions workers. And so, football was something that teams of female munitions workers would take part in at lunchtimes. And then in 1921, the Football Association in Britain says no women allowed to use any FA facilities at all. And yeah, really, this happens in almost every sport you can think of, that there is a decision taken to use the rules and regulations of sport to kind of reshape the character of sport for men only. It's worth noting, I think, that the sort of latter half of the 19th century is the era in which sport becomes organized really for the first time. That,
Yeah.
throughout the 18th century, sport is often quite a sort of spontaneous and informal activity. But in the mid 19th century, it becomes really important to public schools and universities, and particularly, I
Mhm.
think, as a way of shaping boys to be good imperial servants, to further their country's interests abroad. Sport is seen as the way to shape the character of a gentleman. And with that comes a lot of sort of formalization of sport through like rules and regulations, through the publication of results sheets, through sort of almanacs. And those kind of mechanisms give men a way to keep women out. Yeah, you can use rules and regulations to ban women from facilities. Publishing record sheets, suddenly you can consign women to invisibility by just not recording anything that they did. It's those kind of mechanisms that are deployed around the beginning of the 20th century, I think, sort of specifically with the aim of keeping women out.
To me, this is such a sparkly example of how the patriarchy shapeshifts and adapts to new circumstance. That, you had this moment, this window where women were participating in something new that was strengthening them and putting them more on an equal footing with men in a very profound way. And then as it became organized, all of these tactics, like you just talked about, the codification, the rules, the fear mongering around femininity, so many things that sort of over decades maneuvered women out.
Yeah, and I think also the fact that time and time again, where women achieve things and make progress for themselves, men interpret it as taking something away from them. So that actually, in sport in the 1880s and 1890s, it didn't take anything away from men that women had their own races. But, shift 20 years later, and then everything that women's achieve becomes interpreted as an attack on men. Whereas actually, women
Mhm.
aren't necessarily doing it with any reference to men whatsoever. What's, driving a lot of these bans that are imposed on women in sport is anxiety among men about what it means to be a man,
Yeah.
and about the idea that men are degenerating. I mean, that was the kind of word that was used a lot around the turn of the 20th century, that male power and sort of masculine physique were deteriorating, and that, this.
Oh,
Yeah, absolutely. And I
funny.
think, this went hand in hand with like a number of military losses. There was a whole study that was commissioned by the government into, the causes of male physical degeneration that had led to, say, sort of British forces doing so badly in the Boer Wars.
That they were becoming soft or effeminate or whatnot.
Effeminates,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah. And, some men made links between the feminization, the increasing feminization of society. So the sort of idea that, all these spaces that had once been important for making real men were being taken over by women, and that this was having a knock-on effect on men's bodies. That it wasn't just sport, that it was the sort of public sphere in general, that we'd let the women in, we'd let the women into like restaurants and department stores and things. And now the entire, and, sort of politics, and we'd given them rights. And that this had feminized the public sphere to a kind of dangerous extent. So I think a lot of the bans that were imposed in sport were an extension of bans that were kind of imposed more widely in public space.
Yeah. So many things come to mind. But the first thing is that we are, and you write about this also, that we're going through something very similar right now. And this idea that backlash and progress can happen at the same place at the same time. I'm so fascinated by that. As women are making gains, clear gains, you're still seeing these efforts to counter, maybe not even to counter it, but to undermine it somehow.
It's just such a repeating pattern, isn't it? To everything that happened at the beginning of the 20th century with men driving women out of sport and public space. I just sort of see the same arguments being made like 100 years later. The fact, I think, that a lot of the discourse around traditional male values aren't being appreciated anymore in society, and that, sort of men grew up expecting to have power in their family and be the heads of households, and they're not appreciated for that anymore, and they're all redundant and have no sense of purpose.
That
It's just,
anxiety. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And this sort of sense that these uppity women, by like wanting a sort of more kind of equitable household, a sort of equitable parenting structure, these uppity women who want like to work, they're like, we're taking something massive away from men. What really sort of disturbs me, I think, is the conclusion of those types of arguments, that therefore women need to give men what they feel entitled to. Like, rather than perhaps we need to recalibrate the expectations that boys and men are being raised with. Because if
Hmm.
men's pain is coming from this sense of thwarted entitlement, there are two ways to deal with that, aren't there? You either deal with like the entitlement that was kind of wrong in the first place, or you give them everything they want. But then where does it stop?
Exactly. You talk about this movement against women in outdoor spaces or in traditionally male spaces increasingly turn violent. It's not a risk-free, it's not a not dangerous movement. We are seeing an uptick in actual physical violence against women outside of the home, not to speak of inside the home, but keeping to the outdoors.
Yeah, I'm still doing a series of sort of investigations for my Substack, which is looking at bans that men have imposed on women at various times in history across various different countries. What I'm sort of interested in is, sort of questions like, well, what are the spaces that men try and commandeer for themselves? What does it mean to them to have it as a male only space? What would women's presence mean? But one of the questions that I keep coming back to is, well, how do men enforce that male only nature of the space? And actually, the answer is the same every single time. It's through sexual violence. And it's not even really through, I don't know, sort of like regulatory forces or whatever. It's ultimately, it comes down to, if you're going to come into our space, we're going to rape you. And you just sort of see it everywhere. And it's so ubiquitous that it sort of becomes almost like an unspoken contract, that men who sexually harass women often take the attitude, well, you came into this space, what were you expecting? That this is the kind of unwritten contract, that men own public space and that this is the way in which men enforce it. And if a woman comes into that space, then she is tacitly signing up to being harassed. In the 1880s in London, it was the first time that the terminology of street harassment was used.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
it was an era in which women were being more present in the public sphere, visiting sort of cultural activities or going to kind of ladies' clubs, and also in terms of work and, kind of political engagement.
Yeah.
And coupled with that, then, is this instant spark of a flurry of cases of street harassment. And actually, one of the figures who was arrested for street harassment was a guy called Ray Lancaster, who was the director of the Natural History Museum. And, and his defense was, what did that young lady expect if she was going to be walking down the street? Basically, it's just,
Yeah.
women, by coming into these public spaces, are seen as sort of fair game. yeah, the bans that many establishments imposed on women's presence in pubs and bars and restaurants, actually they were enforced by other male drinkers or customers harassing the first women who really did try and come into those spaces. It is ultimately, what patriarchy boils down to, actually. And I think, when I was sort of a bit younger, I used to think that patriarchy was a matter of men's appropriation of women's reproductive capacity. And I think
That only.
increasingly, actually, it sort of, for me, it sort of comes down to sexual violence, really, that this is how patriarchy is maintained.
Yeah. Or appropriating all space. I'm king of all that I see.
Yeah. And I think the fact that it ends up affecting our view of history, right? Because we end up erasing the idea that women were ever in these spaces to begin with. And so, like, I remember having a conversation with someone, like, not that long ago about sort of women's football. And, she's very much a feminist, but said, how actually she felt a bit sorry for men, that this was traditionally a sort of working class male sport. And then women had come in and had sort of taken over their sort of space for male bonding, these kind of interloping women. And I was like, well,
Mm.
no, because actually originally women were there right at the beginning as well. It's just that by men appropriating spaces that were once mixed sex, by men appropriating them for themselves, they drive out our kind of recognition that women were ever there to begin with. And that then reinforces that myth that, yeah, like these awful, grabby, interloping women wanting everything that men held dear to them, rather than actually the truth of it being that, men have stolen these spaces from us.
Right. And also kind of like masculinized it. And so if women come into it, it means that they're taking on these masculine qualities or becoming men somehow.
And you see so many different arguments being recruited to try and justify that. I was really interested in sort of arguments that were put forward by men as to why women shouldn't be climbers, and
Mm.
a lot of it is to do with women are like innately risk averse, but actually, like, women are, sociologically speaking, we're very good risk managers, right? We're often like in charge of managing risk within our family, like managing particularly risky family members or managing risk financially in the family budget. So a woman might put this forward and then they just come up with something else, right? It's all sort of post hoc rationalization.
But of course, also risk slash moving in public spaces is particular. We risk manage all day, every day, vis-a-vis men specifically.
Yeah. And also, I think, what I found really difficult to sort of entangle about that question of risk and how it hinders women is that, as well as the risks that definitely and undoubtedly exist, we're also fed myths of heightened risk to keep us out of spaces. Thinking about, like, when a sort of rapist or a killer on the loose, right? It's often,
Mhm.
police forces, messaging tends to be like women don't take the risk of going out. The outside is dangerous. You need to stay inside. Whereas actually, statistically, women are far more at risk within their own homes with known perpetrators rather than sort of shadowy figures outdoors. Girls growing up, they're having to negotiate between their sort of perception of the very real risks that exist in, say, I don't know, going on a climbing frame or something. But they're
Mm.
also more likely to be told by their parents that those sorts of activities are risky for girls. Statistically, parents are far more likely to tell daughters than sons to, like, oh God, be careful, don't hurt yourself, you're going to fall over, all those sorts of things. I sort of think like we're socialized into viewing the world as riskier than it probably is, whilst at the same time also facing quite a lot of risk. And it's very difficult to sort of disentangle those. I read this kind of brilliant book by a British researcher called Fiona Vera Gray. It's about street harassment. And she talks about how women have been seduced into thinking that the ultimate aim in life is to be safe. So we see risk as antithetical to that, so anything that's sort of dangerous,
Interesting.
potentially
Yeah.
dangerous, if the aim in life is to be safe, then we don't do it. Whereas she says, well, what if the aim in life is to be free? And then you look at this sort of discourse of safety and the way in which risk can be sort of overblown. These are things that actually encourage us to kind of go out and be free, even if we partially compromise our safety in doing that. And that really changed the way I thought about it.
It's changing the way I think about it right now. If women are scared to do anything and we're kind of in this paralyzed, petrified state all the time, then you have men who do bad things to women and they are the villains. And then you have men who are in the constant process of saving us and protecting us from that. Police, the judicial system, blah, blah, blah. The villainy of some men makes other men heroes.
Yeah. And I mean, as you say, that argument that safety is the most important thing for women, it's an argument that is in service of the patriarchy. Debates in the 1920s about whether women should be able to vote or not. It's men who are sort of saying, well, actually, I'm the protector. I represent my wife. And it sort of struck me that, after the awful bus rape and murder in Mumbai.
India.
Yeah, that's right, in India. I was watching a documentary afterwards that was conducting a lot of interviews with quite traditional Indian men, who are describing how their perception is that, women are these jewels that need to be protected and kind of kept in a safe, literally. But that's the same sort of patriarchal power as that of the rapist. It's all about ownership, isn't it? It's all about sort of
100%. Yeah.
the depersonalization of women and girls and seeing them as sort of objects. They're just different incarnations of the same patriarchal power. Seeing one's goal as a woman to be free is sort of granting women agency and individuality and humanity, which is very different. I mean, as you were saying about safety, is that then it sort of defines women in relation to the figures who might make her unsafe, which are men.
Yeah. You did mention a frightening statistics, which actually shocked me, that the increase of women who are murdered while running.
There are more women who have been murdered whilst they've been out running in the last 8 years than in the 30 years before that.
So that, in stark terms, though, even though I'm absolutely with you in that the fear serves a purpose, the violence is so real, I should say. And the fact that women out running were the ones attacked, I think, is very chilling.
Yeah. I mean, I think that statistic is useful to see in the context of the sort of huge increase of male violence towards women worldwide in all scenarios. So actually, if you're out running, you are actually less likely to be assaulted or abused or harassed or murdered than if you're out walking. Okay, so I mean, yes, there has been a rise in the number of women being murdered whilst out running, but it's still a smaller proportion than, sort of women being out in public space in general. This is where I find that idea of sort of freedom versus safety really useful, because I think the problem that women have is that we don't know which men are the dangerous ones, right? It's
That's right.
It is a permanent cost benefit analysis for everything that we do, I think. If I think about life in terms of trying to keep myself safe, I probably wouldn't ever leave the house. But if I think about life in terms of kind of wanting to be free and free to sort of develop myself as a person, as well as being free to move around public space, then I think I'm willing to accept more risk.
I wanted to jump to your Substack, Small Revolutions, every day. And this awakening that you're seeing, you write, my experiences have stripped away widespread delusions I once entertained about men, relationships, and our patriarchal world, and have enabled me to see things the way they really are. And I want to explore that a little bit, this idea of like a new honesty.
So the context is that in January 2022, my husband took his own life in
I'm
a
sorry.
way that was very sudden and violent and extremely traumatic for myself and our daughters. And I sort of feel that, it really sort of ended my life as I knew it. And it made me realize, in the last sort of 3 years, I've had to do a lot of rebuilding. I think it's quite common for people who have been through quite sort of profound traumas that it divides life into kind of the before times, after times.
Yes.
I was very unwell for quite a long time. I was left, being a sort of solo parent, 3 kids. I don't have any family support. We had just moved to a new town where I didn't know anybody. So I didn't have any sort of, friendship network or anything. After he died, I did find out quite a lot about various sort of secrets that he'd been keeping from me for really our whole relationship. We've been together for sort of 14 years. And it really sort of changed how I thought about who he was and how I thought about what our relationship had been. So really, it did feel for a very long time like I'd sort of lost everything and then kind of needed to rebuild in order to kind of keep going. And I think when you have that sort of pivot in your life, it leads you to kind of question everything,
Yeah.
and question everything about things that, even in contexts that I'd sort of taken for granted before. And I suppose a lot of the trauma therapy I've been having, I think, sort of draw a lot on sort of mindfulness and sort of Buddhist ideas. And I was reading this book, Why Buddhism is True. The writer talks about how Buddhism encourages us to question things that we take and, belief systems or ideas that we taken for granted in our lives. And, we come to see them as sort of delusions. Because it sort of feels to me like the major delusion that this crisis in my life has helped me to question and see through are kind of the delusions of patriarchy, the sort of myths that we're raised with. I was raised, I think, not just by my parents, but by kind of culture in general, to think of myself as incomplete without a boyfriend or a husband. And to think of sort of male approval as worth more than female approval. It was always like my male colleagues' approval that I wanted. And that was, bolstered by material things, like the fact that they tended to be more senior and could promote me, And so I think this sort of crisis in my life has made me question and really explore, I think, and want to get to know the extent that, like, I have been shaped by patriarchal delusion. But also, I think, looking at the sort of myths and stories that women everywhere tell ourselves, I spend quite a lot of time reading like feminist self-help, and it's full of sort of women writing in saying, oh, I don't know, like I found a used condom in my husband's bed and it certainly wasn't with me. What could be the explanation? And sort of like, desperately wanting any explanation other than kind of the most likely one. And I think the amount of times like women say to, we say to ourselves, oh, he'd never do that. And I sort of increasingly think that maybe it's more helpful to think the worst of men rather than,
Yes.
to like not give the benefit of the doubt. And that giving the benefit of the doubt is one of those sort of patriarchal delusions.
You do write about that in a legal aspect, that we ought to make laws for the worst men, not the best men, which is very related to that,
Yeah, and I was just sort of struck by how various sort of legal debates that are going on in the present day are sort of shaped and voiced in similar ways to 150 years ago. I guess an example is that sort of idea that, when there's a rapist on the loose, it's women who are kind of essentially put under curfew.
That's right.
And whenever it's suggested that actually maybe there should be a curfew on men, you get men saying, well, no, we don't want our freedoms constricted. You can't devise law on the basis of the worst men. Like it's offensive to us as good men that you think we'd behave like that. But actually, it's exactly the same arguments that were being recruited. I sort of looked at a number of laws over the last 150 years, and that argument's recruited all the time. There were sort of laws that were passed in the mid-Victorian era that were making divorce more easily accessible to women. And the sort of male lawmakers were really offended at these proposals. They're like, you're suggesting that all men beat their wives. And, it's like even back then they'll have, like female campaigners were having to say, not all men, not all men are like that. It's fine. I think what really struck me is looking at examples of sort of pro-feminist legislation, even when women have managed to persuade these men that actually we need to legislate for the worst of male behavior, that legislation is instantly used by men against women. So I found it so fascinating that there's clearly just men watching out for laws being passed and looking at, how they can use them against women. So, the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act in Britain, all the first cases were brought by men. And there were like hundreds of inquiries that were sent into the Equal Opportunities Commission about this. They were men who were members of golf clubs, and they thought it was unfair that female members of golf clubs were having to pay lower fees than them. So they're all sort of wanting the new Sex Discrimination Act to be used to equalise fees for golf clubs. Now, the reason that women's fees were lower was because men said they couldn't use golf clubs apart from times that the men didn't want to play. So that's why women paid less. But these men, they didn't want to kind of equalize access to the golf courses. They just wanted to equalize the fees. And it's just sort of staggering to me that, I don't know, that so many men have the audacity and are so unembarrassed about doing that. And I just sort of think, this is a message, for that history sets up this example to give contemporary legislators of the fact that any loophole is going to be exploited by misogynist men, and that it is absolutely necessary to legislate with the worst of male behavior in mind rather than the best. We have to be pessimistic as legislators, I think, not optimistic.
100%. Also, I think the advent of the internet and social media has exposed male behavior, men communing together around misogynist goals, to be frank, are now visible to more people. And so it's being exposed in a different way. And women are coming around to sort of a radical acceptance, like this is how men communicate about us. We're seeing things, we're seeing male behavior that we haven't been privy to before.
Yeah. Do you think we are seeing it, or do you think we'd rather not see it? I worry that, as a society, we're turning a blind eye to it, really.
Oh, I think, yes, I absolutely agree. I think the inclination to not see it or to look away or refuse the truth of it is very, very strong.
Yeah.
Which is the not all men thing to me.
Yeah. I sort of feel like it's so strongly intertwined with this sort of very strong sense of male entitlement that I think is prevalent right now. And I think what the internet does is both ramp up the entitlement and give form and shape to exactly what it is that men feel entitled to. But also it creates kind of secret spaces where men can sort of offload about their sort of experiences of thwarted entitlement and the sort of hatred that it leads them to develop of the women who dare to thwart their entitlement. there have always been forums through which men's sense of entitlement has been ramped up. I think what's kind of new is this creation of an infinite number of quite hidden and very populous spaces where men express the sheer force of their sort of resentment and hatred towards women for thwarting that entitlement. Whereas I guess previously it might have been, prior to the internet, sort of manifested among small groups of men in person or manifested in direct male violence towards women. But I sort of think now there are a lot of men who might sort of outwardly appear quite normal,
Yeah.
who in secret part of these male communities that are centered around hatred of women for not being submissive enough.
Yeah, and for what they perceive as being losing ground in as far as their control of the women in their lives. In some ways, I think the porn explosion is very much part of this. You talked about that in an article about Adolescence, the Netflix series that was so popular about a boy who had ostensibly killed a female schoolmate because she rejected him. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And it sort of seems to me that what's quite widely accepted is the idea that porn gives shape to sort of erotic shape to kind of men's resentment of women, through the prevalence of sort of violent porn. But I think what isn't sort of recognized quite as much is how porn enables male bonding over that. Adolescence is very much built on the idea that the kids, kind of young teenage boys, are all sort of living these secret online worlds that Luddite adults don't know anything about. And they're all sort of angsting about the fact that they'll never get girlfriends. And then, the minute a girl tells them that they're ugly, their hatred has been kind of ramped up so much on these sort of online sites that one of them goes off and kills her. But I think it makes the mistake of seeing this kind of online behavior as something that's the kind of province of young boys.
Mm.
And for a previous book, I spent quite a lot of time on a website called Punternet, which is a sort of website where men who use prostitutes kind of compare notes, and it's a sort of chat forum for them. Honestly, if women, if you're listeners, do you want to cast off the delusions of patriarchy and see men for who they really are? It's a good place to start, because the way they talk about women is just vile. And I think, as part of that research, I looked at, sort of other sites that revolve around porn and prostitution and that incorporate a kind of community element, because it's that community element that I think people often aren't aware exists. There's, a website called Adult Work, which is quite a kind of gateway website through which men often transition from watching porn to booking prostitutes in person. There's a certain amount of free content, and then they buy tokens that will give them access to various cam girls in their galleries. And then there's also a sort of directory of prostituted women they can contact. It also is a site through which men message other men, not to have sex with one another necessarily, but both for the logistics of prostitution, so sort of sharing tips around, which hotels or Airbnbs will turn a blind eye, organizing gangbangs, but also just sort of chatting and sort of sharing notes. And, that's not a benign activity when what they're sharing notes about absolutely revolves around and feeds off and ramps up misogyny. They are sort of egging each other on to talk about women as if we're something they've bought off a Just Eat menu, like a hamburger they've chosen to order that morning or something. The sort of dehumanization, the absolute sort of scathing reviews that women who are obviously trafficked get. And again, it's this sort of bruising of male entitlement. They felt entitled to an encounter where they didn't have to come face to face with the realities of the sex industry, and they saw those realities, but instead of sort of actually thinking they might change their behavior, they turn it back on the woman. Reading studies about the amount of time that porn addicted men spend on these kind of sites, it's really extraordinary, 4 to 8 hours a day, right? And
yeah.
it's like, can you imagine your head being in that kind of space with those kind of images and those kind of attitudes 8 hours a day? There's no way, right, that it's not going to bleed over into the rest of your life.
That's right.
And I sort of think, this is one of those things that we women don't often want to properly look at, is actually the men who we encounter in our day-to-day lives. Is it their minds and bodies that are being immersed in this world, and that's obviously going to shape how they interact with us. And sometimes you see glimpses of it, I think, I don't know, just sort of, when men are staring at your tits when they're talking to you, and then you get these flashes of hatred when you, I don't know, we had these, not the builders at the back of the house, but the scaffolders who were there before the builders. They turned up at 7:00, one Sunday morning. And I was quite pissed off about this. And, we've got sort of regulations here that say you're not allowed to do noisy building work at 7 a.m. Yeah, so I asked them to shut up. And, this guy was sort of, it's the combination of the fact he was kind of staring at my tits whilst also looking at me with such naked hatred. And what I was asking him to do, which was to not work on a Sunday, did not warrant the kind of looks I was getting. So I sort of think you get those glimpses sometimes.
Absolutely. Or the speed with which you're out and about and a man decides to approach you, and the speed with which it turns from pursuit to violence. I mean, I've experienced that hundreds of times in my life.
Yeah. And I think what's sort of upsetting me kind of at the moment is how young it starts, I went for a run the other day, and this boy who I know how old he is because he's at my daughter's school. And, he made some comment about oh, give us a smile, love, that kind of really standard kind of catcalling. I told him to sod off, at which point he started making porno sex noises at me. And I was like, you're 10. Where the fuck? I mean, just shocking and awful.
Yeah, but that is something that was very glossed over and not included in adolescence. Adolescence kind of talked about the manosphere and incel culture and vague emoji language, but it did not mention porn. It did not mention this community that you talk about of online sexual exploitation forums. And that's not an incel culture. I wouldn't call that manosphere. I would just call that men doing what they do.
No, I totally agree. I sort of feel I'm not sure that the writers of adolescence, and I'm saying this purely from the point of view of a viewer, but to me, it didn't seem like a program that was made that was actually really about incel culture. I sort of felt what it was really about was denial. It was looking at kind of Jamie's denial that he'd done anything, just in the face of the CCTV evidence, and his parents' denial that he'd done anything. So I sort of felt the way that the series was structured and, what happens at the end seemed to me to be far more about that narrative of sort of cognitive dissonance and denial in the face of unavoidable evidence. And it sort of seemed to me the incel storyline was sort of secondary to that, or was the vehicle through which that was being explored. But I sort of don't really want to kind of criticize the program, because it sort of seems to me more weight is being put on the program than it was intended to have.
Sure.
It seemed to me to be a program that was sort of designed to open our eyes to incel culture. And it's sort of fairly baffling to me that our political administration wants to show it in schools, because it's kind of
yes.
what are young girls supposed to take away from this program, right? That they shouldn't turn down boys' advances because they might get stabbed. There isn't a good message for girls to take away from this program. So I just sort of think we're projecting things onto it that it wasn't really supposed to have, maybe.
Yeah, part of what triggered me about adolescence is this, like, and you write about this too, the myth that boys are falling behind, that they're under-resourced, that they're in some kind of a crisis, and you debunk that in some important ways.
Yeah, I think the sort of current mood I'm in my life, I'm sort of instinctively quite sort of suspicious, I guess, of a lot of myths about tortured masculinity, I suppose. And we have this like very sort of prevalent myth that men's mental health is in crisis, and that this is demonstrated by the fact that men commit suicide far more than women do. And, you know, even before I lost my husband to suicide, this was something that I was sort of quite interested in, because I sort of come across a study that showed that, well, the reason that men complete suicide more than women is because men choose far more violent methods that are far more likely to succeed the first time, rather than women who tend to opt for methods such as overdoses or poisoning, which, you know, is sort of less likely to succeed. And then I kind of came across the statistic that actually women attempt suicide far more than men. All the sort of metrics of female mental health are much, much worse than male mental health. You know, the levels of depression, levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, levels of anxiety, levels of eating disorders, everything is higher for women. And so it just sort of makes me question the instant I sort of hear, like, you know, society is weighted against men. It makes me kind of want to dig into it and question it. And yeah, as you say, there's this sort of very prevalent myth that for years now, like, boys have been underachieving at school, and that this is the fault of an educational system that is biased towards girls and girls' preferred methods of learning. You know, one of the examples that's given is that boys tend to be better at exams because, you know, you can wing them a bit, you can do last minute revision. You know, often they just kind of require like confidence and flair and arrogance, whereas coursework based exams are likely to favor people who are good at putting in effort over the long term and, you know, kind of sustained graft, you know. Anyway, so I wanted to kind of look into this and, you know, ask, I suppose, first of all, whether it's true that boys' education attainment is worse than girls. And I suppose kind of the answer is, well, yes, it is, but it's also always been thus. Like, this isn't a new thing. This has been in place since like the 50s or 60s, really, which is kind of when reliable records started to be kept. The reason isn't to do with a biased educational system that's biased towards girls, because that gap in educational attainment has been there throughout lots of shifts in pedagogy and assessment, and it stayed the same. You know, so actually the
Interesting.
gap is far more to do with the fact that boys are socialized to not have as much respect for authority as girls. So boys' behavior in schools tends to be worse, which means that they learn less.
Hmm.
And it tends to kind of even out. The gendered educational gap tends to get smaller the higher up the educational ladder you get. So at university, there isn't really much of a gap. And it has no bearing on status in the workplace, which is still riven by a gender pay gap, and in which, in most industries, men are still in the most sort of authoritative and well-paid roles. And I think what sort of worried me about it, like the truth of this really, is that it's such a kind of unquestioned myth in this country that girls do better in exams and at school than boys. And that, you know, this sets up boys for a sort of lifetime of low self-esteem and failure. It's the source of various suggestions that are given by very authoritative bodies to teachers and head teachers. And so they say that it's absolutely fine to have a boys only tutor group for boys who are underachieving. And it's absolutely fine to have a boys only tutor group for boys who are high achievers because they need that sort of extra support. But that it's not okay to have girl only tutor groups in any circumstances because boys need the positive influence of girls beside them as they're learning. And, this just, I couldn't believe this when I read this. It was so shocking that, it's sort
Amazing.
of seen as okay to sort of view girls as support humans, rather than as people in their own right with their own skills and talents and aspirations and educational needs and futures, and that actually this guidance really suggests, discriminating against girls in favor of boys on the basis of a myth that just isn't true. It's so enraging.
Yeah, that there's this manufactured sympathy for boys lagging behind, and then resources are put to that quote unquote problem, and girls' needs are just not talked about in that way.
Yeah, and that girls' needs are, harmed. I'm sure
Yes.
lots of sort of parents of daughters have the experience of their daughters, particularly at primary school, made to sit next to badly behaved, low achieving boys because it's seen that, bright, hardworking, conscientious girls are the positive influence that the boys need, without thinking about the fact that actually it can really harm girls' learning to be next to a disruptive boy. I have 3 daughters, and they're all absolutely furious when they're put, when they're made to sit next to the worst behaved boys in their class. Because they're like, I couldn't concentrate, I couldn't hear anything that was being said. He was scribbling all over my work, he copied my work. It doesn't bring anything to the girls. And it's such a kind of standard thing for, particularly I think at primary, for teachers to do. And I just think it should be abolished. It's just awful.
It is awful. It's making girls into shock absorbers for entitled boys. And it's not like the boys are modeling themselves on the girls. That's not happening. They're just acting out, and the girls take the consequences.
The message it sends to young girls is one that stays with them for their whole lives, I think, that their role is to manage boys and men, that their needs aren't as important, that they need to be a calming influence for angry men. I mean, it's enraging that it's played out in the educational sphere and the professional sphere, but it's devastating that it's kind of played out in relationships and, abusive relationships later on, I think, because it's the same dynamic that's being played out.
Yes, yes. Male entitlement and women just absorbing it in all spheres of life. All right, so we're at 2 hours, but it was such a pleasure
it's lovely.
to
It's
talk
really
to you.
lovely to chat to you. Thank you so much.
Such a great conversation, and love your writing. I love all of the new areas you're writing about, and I recommend your Substack to everyone I know.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it just feels like what I kind of want to be writing at the moment. And again, it's that sort of sense that if I've experienced something, I can't be the only one, and that surely what I've learnt might be helpful to some other people, other women.
Oh, I think it resonates a lot.
Good. I'm glad.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to Subject to Power. You can find the show online at subjecttopower.com or subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts. I'd love to know your thoughts on these conversations, so please drop a note on the website or find us on social media. The best way to support the show is to rate and review Subject to Power on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other listeners find us. Subject to Power is written, hosted, and produced by me, Elle Kamihira. Audio engineering is done by Jason Sheasley at Abridged Audio. Cover art by B. Johnson, and music by Beware of Darkness.